Okay, dynamic processing, advanced techniques. This is part 3, and sidechaining first of all. So, the most common use of sidechaining is with kick and bass channels, and this is to give clarity to the kick channel, so you don't have to turn it up too loud, and it still comes through the mix when the bass plays at the same time as the kick, so that you don't get this sort of cloudy or muffledness between the low end of the kick and the bass. So here's my kick. Okay, and here's my bass channel. My bass channel already has a compressor compressing the bass. But then I have a second compressor ready to go on here. Okay, and it has a sidechain input of audio 1, which is my kick channel. Okay, so if I just play the two now without any sidechain compression on. Okay, now I'm going to add the sidechain compression. Here we go. So without it. Now with it, here we go, 3 and... Okay, so the kick is just punching out of the mix a little bit more by compressing the bass every time the kick happens. There's a good graphic example of it. And it's got a quick attack and quick release times over here. Let me give you another example of using sidechain compression. A couple on this one actually. What we're going to do is solo the kick, snare, overheads and bass. And again with this one, I've sidechained the bass line off of the kick. So let's listen without and then with. Okay, now I'm going to add it. So the kick basically has become easier to pick out all the frequencies of it because the bass isn't getting in the way. Now, this idea about sidechain compressing one sound off another can be taken to another level with use of on percussion, for example. So in this instance, I have 2 percussion channels. I'm just going to put one on with the kick and snare. And basically, because the percussion channel is happening right on top of the kick and the snare, I found that the percussion sounds were flamming with the kick and snare. Okay? So what I did was I sent the kick and the snare to a bus. Okay? Then I grabbed a compressor, I put it over the percussion channel, and I used a bus send input on the sidechain here in order to compress the sound of the percussion, okay, when the kick and snare happen. So you'll see that every time the kick and snare happen, the percussion is compressed. So without it, and then with it. So it's a way of ducking something away from the kick and snare. Now you could achieve a similar thing with a gate as well, okay, by popping a gate on and then using bus 1 as the gate trigger. Okay, letting some of the signal through, but every time the gate occurs, it shuts the channel. So it's only letting the percussion through when the kick and snare are not playing. Okay? So it's good for adding definition, if you see what I'm saying. Okay? All right, so let's have another look at how we can use sidechaining in a more electronic sense. In this instance, I'm using an Ultrabeat to play me a standard house music pattern, like so. Okay? And what I've done is separate the kick using multi-output Ultrabeat so that I have the kick coming on a separate channel, like so, and I've sent the signal to a bus. Now, when you create a bus, it automatically creates an auxiliary, which I don't need when I'm side chaining. So I have to kill off the input for this. Once I've created this bus and not sent it to an auxiliary, it's just going to allow me to send the sound to an effect. All right? So, I've got the kick separate. I've got a compressor over a pad sound, which sounds like this. Okay, so now I'm going to add this compressor on top. So I'm using the kick as the sidechain input, and you'll notice that the attack is quite quick. The release is at 45 milliseconds. Now, I want this sidechain to release in time with the tune. And I want it to release every eighth of a beat. So it goes one, like that. And in order to do that, I need it to release after a certain amount of milliseconds. Now, I could actually work that out by adding to the length of my kick drum the number of milliseconds I need to reach a particular delay time. For example, I need it to go to an eighth of a beat, which is around 200 and something milliseconds. So I've got 45 milliseconds here, and my kick is 150 milliseconds long. So when you combine them together, you get... Now, I could just do that by ear, do you know what I mean, and get the sound right. But if I'm unsure of what time to use, subtract the length of the kick drum from an eighth delay speed, which in this case is 200 odd milliseconds, and you add the amount of release that's left, and you'll get an exact eighth of a beat. Okay, and that's what's making that. As you can see, the other parameters is quite very high ratio, quite a lot of threshold to make it pull and push. Right now, then. The other common way to use sidechaining is to use it, as I said, on a gate. And we can make automatic gate triggers. One of the most famous examples of a producer using another instrument to trigger the gate on a sound is Nile Rodgers. When he was doing the Chic productions, he would get the string players and the keyboard players who weren't very funky to play long chords. And then he would put a gate over the sound and trigger patterns using his guitar as the input, so he could make a pattern. Okay, and I've emulated an example of that by using what is known as the Klopfgeist. And the Klopfgeist is actually the thing that creates the click track for you, but you can make triggers with it. You can actually also create the most ridiculous sub-bass with this thing by making this do something like this. Okay, so it's great for actually, if you wanted to make your kick drum have extra bass, do you know what I mean, and tune it in, you could get the Klopfgeist to trigger underneath and just provide that extra sub that you need, okay? However, in this instance, I'm just creating a trigger, like... So, with my trigger, I'm going to use it by sending it to a bus 2. And again, Logic is far too helpful and creating auxiliaries. So I'm going to say no input to that auxiliary, thank you. I just want it to go into the ether, and I want the noise gate here to pick it up and use it as a sidechain input. So this is the effect we can create. You remember what the pad sounded like before? Well, now check this out. Now I can blend the original signal back in with it. This can be very, very handy if you want to create a pulsating feeling in something that's static. The important thing here to remember is that you can use any pattern. You don't have to create a new pattern. You could think, right, my hi-hat pattern's wicked, and I wish my pad would trigger when my hi-hat triggers. And you could use your hi-hat pattern as the trigger for this. Okay, so let's move on to multipression. Multipressors allow you to compress the sound but be frequency conscious about it, man. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Here's a bit of Bob, and with Bob there was one particular frequency within his high mid that I wanted to make sure didn't get too loud. So what I've done is this.
Would ya provide a bread? Is this love, is this love, is this love, is this love that I'm feeling?
So everything below 100 hertz, which I didn't want, is compressed. And then in the middle area, in this high mid area, when he sings these lines,
would ya provide a bread? Is this love, is this love?
Sometimes is a little bit too harsh, but it's not all the way through. So just when it gets too harsh,
provide a bread?
It just compressed that frequency.
Is this love, is this love, is this love that I'm feeling?
Give you another quick example. Let's go to the ladies singing the oohs. Now they sing lots of different things on this particular track. So there was one particular frequency around 500 hertz that made them sound a bit boxy, but on the other vocals they were fine. So I've bypassed all the other sections here, okay, but left on this one area just here. Without them, it sounds like this. Now with it. So it's just smoothing out a frequency that occurs, but only in a certain part of the take. Okay. Another thing to think about with this is when you're going to use it on a vocal, as I tend to do quite a lot, what I like to do is I like to bypass the high end. You don't need to overcompress the high end of things, especially vocals. So you can bypass compression of the really high frequencies and just let them pass through. In this instance, I've got a lead vocal that's already been compressed gently once off the 2 takes, which was the thing I was using in the demo video.
Footsteps on the dance floor reminds me, baby, you.
Now I wanted to compress her quite heavily, so I'm going to add another compressor to the group. Okay, and with this compressor, I'm using quite a quick attack and release, and it should feel more powerful.
Reminds me, baby, you. Teardrops in my eyes. Next time I'll be true.
There's a couple of points here and here where it gets a little harsh. Listen.
Footsteps on the dance floor.
So that footsteps gets a bit harsh, but the rest of it sounds really nice. So if I use a multipressor, I can isolate that frequency here, okay, and increase the ratio, increase the threshold, and then check it out.
Footsteps on the dance floor reminds me, baby, you.
So let's listen to it without.
Footsteps on the dance floor.
And now with it.
Footsteps on the dance floor.
And it's just calmed down those particular moments. Now think about the nightmare you'd have having to EQ and do a separate channel so that you didn't lose that frequency when it didn't get too much. Do you know what I mean? So adding a little multiband, and as I said, you could just use one part of it if you wanted to. All right.